when we look at the health of an inventory, it's like you have to have it wide but not too deep. And then you also have to look at part number population. Like when you're working on these things, did your part number population increase? Because that means you're selling more parts.
Yep.
And that's what we're looking at. And then when you sell more parts, you retain more customers because you have the parts. And then techs are happier because they're not like, hey, where's this part? But it sounds simple, right?
Welcome to Retention Roadmap, navigating service success for new car dealerships. I'm your host, Bill Springer, and today's podcast is sponsored by DriveSure. DriveSure helps new car dealerships remain the go-to provider for maintenance, tires, and repairs. For information on how DriveSure can help your dealership retain more customers for scheduled maintenance and unplanned repairs, go to drivesure.com/dealership solutions. Today, I'm excited to welcome Kaylee Felio, Sales and Marketing Manager for PartsEdge and host of Trailblaze Your Path podcast, as well as the Parts Management podcast. Kaylee is a leading voice in the automotive industry, helping dealerships optimize their parts departments to better serve customers and improve dealership loyalty. Through her podcasts and professional work, she provides valuable insights and actionable strategies for tackling the challenges of parts operations. And in today's episode, we'll explore how a well-managed parts strategy, including tire operations, can play a vital role in keeping customers coming back to the dealership. So let's dive right in. Kaylee, welcome to the podcast. Great to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
So let's dive right in. We're just in the early parts of 2025, and I'm just curious from your perspective in terms of what's changed in the industry. What do you see as kind of some of the biggest challenges for a dealership's parts operations in the upcoming year or so?
I don't think it's any new challenges. I think it's continuing to be the challenge of lack of time, keeping up with manufacturer programs. Obsolescence is always a big topic at the beginning of the year because everyone's doing physical inventories and just looking at everything a little bit closer.
Right.
So, there's just, I mean, I always say this, parts managers are fighting a uphill battle with all the things they have to deal with. It's not just ordering parts. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think dealers are really looking at this asset, their parts inventory a lot closely, and seeing how they can really make more profit with it.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what I'm seeing more focus on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, because our podcast is focused on customer retention, and what can really everyone in the dealership do to help enhance customer retention, retain customers more frequently and over a longer period of time. From your perspective, what do you see as being how well run parts department can contribute to enhancing customer retention for the dealership?
Well, I mean, the parts department is basically the backbone of it all, really. Like if you don't have the parts to serve your customers, then it's like the full circle. But I mean, there are some things that are a little bit out of the hands of the parts department when it comes to the availability of some of the parts.
Right.
So I think the biggest thing in regards to retention is that just over communicating with your customers and making them aware that some things are out of your hands. And I don't really have a solution for some of the things that some of the manufacturers or the parts departments are dealing with not having some of these parts and not really having answers of when they're going to get some of these parts for
Right.
the recalls and warranty work. But the only solution I have is just communicating and getting creative with it.
Yeah. How have you seen, in terms of that communication, how have you seen kind of technology play a role in making it easier to communicate with customers or, more communicating with customers on a more timely basis that, hey, that part that you've been waiting for X period of time is finally here?
I've seen some technology implemented or heard some technology that's been implemented to help and just make sure that they're tracking those parts and then making whatever team or whoever is in charge of communicating with the customer, because at some dealerships have the parts department do it, some dealerships have BDCs, just making sure that they're using that technology to track everything but then also communicate so that they can plan ahead.
In terms of stocking strategies, from your perspective, what strategies do you recommend for parts departments to make sure that they're, stocking, I should say, particularly for tires, or other key parts. What type of strategies do you recommend that they use to make sure that they are keeping those high moving parts on hand and they're turning their inventory quickly?
Well, that's a big question. Um, I can focus on tires for a little bit, and then I guess we'll go into the big picture. But I mean, the biggest thing I think when you think about tires, you have to think about it as a separate business, just like you think of wholesale, or if you're in the online kind of business of that. If you're in the tire business, you got to be in the tire business. You can't have one foot in, one foot out, because then you're
Yeah.
not going to have the right tires. You're not going to be focused on it. So I think when it comes to that, I mean, most parts managers, I assume, isolate those tires, and I think even some even break out the different types of tires, the lower end, the medium, the high, so that they're really tracking the phase in criterias of it or whatnot. But overall, the strategy that we've seen be successful is really just breaking out the different commodities of parts and tracking them a lot closely, getting really dynamic with your phase in criterias, because you're breaking out your parts a little bit more granularly. um,
Hmm.
so it's not really like this perfect we have this perfect like strategy. It's more of like actually looking at your true market demand and seeing what you actually need to stock based
Right.
on data
Yep.
and your actual data. So
Yep.
I don't
Can
know
you
if that
tell?
makes sense.
Can you tell us what you mean by phase-in criteria?
Yeah. So in the DMS, certain when you how detailed do I want to get? So in the DMS, there's sources or stocking groups, and sources aren't where you source parts. Sources are what we like to explain like file cabinet or a file folder in the file cabinet, where you can set specific phasing criterias or pricing for the different types of parts that you're
Gotcha.
looking at. So phasing criteria could be like a three. I think the standard is like 3 and 9. You get three hits in the 9 month period. That's basically triggers your DMS to, you might want to stock this part. But you also have to have different types of phasing criteria for different types of parts. So
Hmm.
it's not just, yeah.
Gotcha.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. When you look at best practices, for parts departments, what are some of the best practices that you recommend for dealerships to optimize, their parts departments for not only better retention but just better operation, lower cost, more profitability, that type of thing.
Well, we look at our whole focus is on inventory control and inventory health.
Yep.
So that really, I mean, that is how you can look at the profit, because you're looking at where your money or your dollars are actually sitting. It just depends on what kind of level your parts department or your parts manager is at, and just identifying where do they need more support. Do they need more support in process? Do they need more support in inventory control? How are you holding your parts department accountable with inventory health? I think that's a big topic or question, because the management reports, you kind of have to go in 10 different places to actually see the health of your inventory, and how are you holding your team accountable to,
Hmm.
yeah, that asset.
Yep. Yeah. So it's all about kind of minimizing your investment in your inventory, but also making sure that you minimize the amount of time that a part might be out of stock, uh,
Yeah.
because that's going to impact other departments of the dealership, not to mention customer satisfaction.
Yes, you have to. I always say it's like full circle. It's like you have to have the parts, but it's like this fine balance or perfect mix, because when we look at the health of an inventory, it's like you have to have it wide but not too deep. And then you also have to look at part number population. Like, when you're working on these things, did your part number population increase? Because that means you're selling more parts.
Yep.
And that's what we're looking at. And then when you sell more parts, you retain more customers because you have the parts. And then techs are happier because they're not like, "Hey, where's this part?" But it sounds simple, right?
Easier said than done, I'm sure.
Yeah.
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 I mean, it's easier said than done, but you have to also like consider how many tools are available for parts managers to really help them. there's not very many out there to help. When you look at like a used car manager, how many tools are you giving them to make those decisions and turn that profit?
Right, right. So along those lines, Kaylee, tell us a little bit about your role with PartsEdge and what PartsEdge is what their reason for being and what they do for dealerships.
Well, my role is sales and marketing, so I think it's the best job because I get to be creative. I get to really show what we can do or talk about what we can do at dealerships, and then what we actually do is, like I think I've mentioned, is really looking at the health of the inventory, supporting parts managers, and really getting everyone on the same page, because I feel like historically the parts department's always been like this black hole, the redhead stepchild of the
Yeah.
dealership. And we're really bringing everyone together to understand that um, it's not just about, it is about stocking parts, but it's not just that simple.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And how much of a role does kind of number crunching and analytics play in what you do?
Um, Well, I feel like it's a big role because we're really looking at those numbers, and then how can we help affect those numbers? Is it a process change? Is it something that needs to change in the DMS? So I mean, data and numbers is all that that's how we really can see and paint the picture of what's happening.
Right. Right. Gotcha.
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, certainly on the retention side of the business, some pretty dramatic changes in the tools available to us to measure a dealership's, everything from retention to isolating variables to, you know, what what's our retention for customers who are driving vehicles more than 100,000 miles, and how much more frequently do they return versus customers that are driving, vehicles that might be have lower miles on them and that type of thing, and how can we position our service marketing strategy to make sure that we're going after the right customer segments, and which ones are at risk of leaving, which ones are more valuable, and that type of thing. And
Yeah, because you can't treat all the customers the same. Like a
no,
person that just bought a car a year ago has a different mindset than someone who has a car that's 5, 10 years old.
right,
So you have
right,
to kind of market to them. So that's awesome that you guys can really look at that data. I love data,
yeah,
just how you can organize it all.
yeah, absolutely. And the reason that we look at tires so much is because we know the tires are a big point of defection for dealerships, and we
Mhm.
also know, and this is one of the things I'll be talking about at NADA, even though this episode will air after NADA, is spending a lot of time about tires and the fact that you really can't over communicate with your customers on tires, and we're using our analytics there to try and get a much better understanding of customer behavior and what's working and what's not working. What we found is that um, almost a third of active service customers at new car dealerships don't even realize that their dealership sells tires, which is mind blowing for those of us who are in and out of dealerships every day, and we see tire displays and we see ads and that type of thing. But still, one out of every three customers doesn't even know if their dealership sells tires. So we dig into that data a little bit more, and we look at the behavior of those who do say, "Yes, I know that my dealership sells tires." And when it comes time for those customers to buy tires, we see a 10 percentage point swing in terms of their uh, behavior of actually purchasing tires at the dealership. So being able to dig into those analytics is really insightful, that can then inform what strategies we put in place for promoting tires and that type of thing. So
Can you guys Can you speak to like the profit on tires? Because I know that's like the biggest thing I get from parts managers really, is just like there's not really a whole like profit margin with tires. And I feel like, I mean, I'm kind of answering the questions, but you could agree that it's not really about what you're making on the tires. It's the bigger picture of the retention of like they're gonna think about you for everything that you
yeah,
need.
yeah, and I understand a parts manager's perspective on that. Yeah,
Mhm.
they're low margin. They take up a lot of space.
Mhm.
They're kind of a pain to deal with. But I think this is really where it's up to leadership of the dealership the general manager, the dealer principal, the platform manager, whatever it may be, is to help everybody in a dealership understand that there are times when we're not going to make as much money that we want on a service transaction. But by doing so, if we are successful at selling that customer one tire or a set of tires, the likelihood of them returning and being a customer for a longer period of time is much, much higher. So let's look at the overall, lifetime customer value of that relationship with our customer, and make sure that we provide them with the service that they need. It's almost like saying, well, on that first service visit, we don't make enough money on on the repair order. Well, it's a brand new vehicle, and that doesn't mean that you don't want them to come back for that first service visit, that you only want them to come back when the vehicle is 6 years old. That's not reasonable. And it's not reasonable either to expect that, well, we're only gonna sell tires to customers who are, gonna pay us a lot of money for it. That doesn't,
Yeah.
you know,
That doesn't make sense. Well, and I feel like too, it builds trust when you have a customer and you're presenting all the future of what they need to prepare for their vehicle. Because I feel like we in the industry and a lot of times in the dealership too, we take for granted how much we understand and know about our vehicle, and we assume they know too. And it's like we can't think like that, because you have to give them the information to decide. You cannot decide for them. And I do
right,
think that showing them like, hey, you might need to prepare for tires in this amount of time, doing the MPI and showing every area, that helps people understand what they need to prepare for. And then they know I go to my dealership for everything I need for my car,
right.
tires
Yeah,
included.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really, I think, understanding the big picture, and really looking at that overall customer life cycle, and knowing that, what those key defection points are, and those key points where we really need to pay close attention, because we're really at risk of potentially losing that customer. And we know
Absolutely.
that those are, the first service visit. We know that it's when they need tires. We know that it's when they have an unplanned repair or a breakdown, for instance. Who
Mhm.
they call for a tow has a tremendous impact on whether or not they wind up back at the dealership
That
or
makes
wind
sense.
up somewhere else.
Yeah.
And, again, looking at the analytics, our analytics show that about two-thirds of customers who are servicing their vehicle at new car dealerships no longer have OEM roadside assistance. So, they're really at risk of calling, say, a AAA and being towed somewhere else, or even if they are still under the OEM factory roadside, that doesn't mean that they're going to be towed back to the servicing dealer. Typically, it means they're going to be towed to the nearest franchise dealership of the same make. So it's all of those little things that really, add up over time to making sure that we're addressing every customer need at those critical defection points.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I think from a, you know, from your perspective, what would you, what would you recommend, if anything, for dealerships that are really looking to strengthen the connection between their parts department and other departments in the dealership, to help everybody synchronize and work better together?
Oh, well, I mean, I always hate saying this, but I think it's like reality. If you are not paying everyone off of everything and connecting it all together, that's that's the reason why they're not working together. I think when their pay plans are affected by, if parts is affected by technicians and like everything, that's when when you can connect all of that, that's when I feel like you can really get them seeing the bigger picture and how certain things are affecting, everyone. I think once, if you are already doing that and then you're still feeling this like disconnect, I've even seen or heard dealerships where they kind of like walking in your shoes, like you swap and show like,
Yeah,
hey, this is what it's like to be in parts service, and service, this is what it's like to be in, or parts, you know what I mean. So
sure.
that's another perspective too. I know that's like crazy to think about with how crazy everyone's day is, but if you take that time to really like walk in their shoes,
Yeah,
you can get a whole new perspective on.
yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So before I let you go, Kaylee, tell us about we were talking before we started recording about your two podcasts. Tell us about those a little bit.
Yeah, well, so it was called the Parts Girl podcast, and now I rebranded it to Trailblaze Your Path podcast because I was really finding that I was actually interviewing trailblazers in the industry, and I felt like naming it the Parts Girl podcast kind of limited the visibility because people thought parts, and that's all we're going to talk about, and it really wasn't that. But I had this vision that I wanted a source or a way to for anyone really to get parts information or education. So we branched it off and called it the Parts Management Podcast. So we have Parts Management Podcast and we have Trailblaze Your Path podcast. So I know it's a lot. It's a lot for me too because I'm like, oh my gosh, I have two podcasts now, and it was a little bit of a like, how do I market this? How do I separate and keep it all
Right.
organized? And I feel like I finally have a flow, and people still, think of me as the parts girl, and that's what I want to because I'm still the same person, but I'm also just opening the like horizon of like the Trailblaze Your Path is not just about parts. It's amazing people in the industry. We talk about fixed ops, we talk about variable, we talk about anything really.
Hmm.
And then the parts management one is very much like I'm interviewing the founder of PartsEdge, really getting into the nitty gritty of like, what does obsolescence mean? What is a realistic day supply? All those things that parts managers need help with. So
Sure. Well, that's fantastic. Well, I'm sure you're going to kill it on both ends. And that's super. Kaylee, if any of our listeners would like to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn if you're pretty active there. It's just Kaylee Felio. If you want to reach out to me directly, I'm sure the information's in the links or whatnot, but find me on partsedge.com, LinkedIn, all that fun stuff.
Super. Well, we'll include that information in the show notes as well.
Cool.
So thank you, Kaylee, for being with us today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Retention Roadmap, Navigating Service Success for New Car Dealerships. Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.